Some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood. In Hollywood, where every whisper becomes a headline and every glance gets photographed, there exists a quiet rebellion. Stars who refuse to perform their identity for the cameras, who let their art, their style, their presence speak instead of press releases. They walk red carpets in gender-fluid fashion. They kiss their co-stars with electric ambiguity. They move through the world with a freedom that feels like permission, like an invitation, like a mirror held up to everyone watching who's ever felt like they don't quite fit the boxes the world prepared for them. No announcements, no magazine covers, no carefully crafted coming-out statements. Just 8 people who chose to exist on their own terms, leaving the world to wonder, or better yet, to simply watch and understand. If you've ever felt that kind of freedom calling, hit subscribe, because tonight we're telling their stories. Harry Styles, the man who dissolved the box. When Harry Styles appeared on the cover of Vogue in a flowing dress, the internet didn't just react, it combusted. Some celebrated, some raged. But what mattered most was this. Harry didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. The dress, the pearls, the feather bows he wore on stage, they weren't costumes or statements. They were simply Harry being Harry. From his One Direction days to his solo career, he's built a world where masculinity doesn't have borders, where a man can wear nail polish and kiss his bandmates on stage and sing about falling in love without pronouns, and none of it requires a label or an explanation. "I've never felt the need to really label anything," he once said. And that refusal, that gentle, unbothered defiance, became its own revolution. At his concerts, pride flags wave like a natural part of the landscape. Fans of every identity gather not just to hear music, but to feel seen. To exist in a space where expression isn't questioned, where fluidity isn't feared, where being yourself is the only requirement for belonging. Harry doesn't lecture about identity politics. He doesn't perform queerness for applause. He just lives, bold, tender, shimmering, and in doing so, gives millions of people permission to do the same. His style speaks louder than any interview ever could. Silk blouses, glittering suits, gentle gestures that blur every rigid line society drew around what a man should be. In a culture desperate for certainty, for boxes and labels and clear definitions, Harry Styles offers something far more radical: the freedom to simply exist, to be soft and strong, masculine and feminine, clear and mysterious. He proves that authenticity isn't about fitting in. It's about breaking every mold and building something entirely your own. Timothée Chalamet, soft masculinity in sharp focus. Before soft masculinity became a trending phrase, Timothée Chalamet was already embodying it, effortlessly, unapologetically, and with a grace that felt almost otherworldly. He doesn't look like Hollywood's traditional leading men. He's slender, delicate-featured, radiating vulnerability rather than brute strength. And that difference became his power. On the red carpet, he doesn't play it safe. Glittering harnesses from Heider Ackermann, hoodies paired with Cartier jewelry. Louis Vuitton looks that blur masculine and feminine into something entirely new. Each outfit tells a story about a man unafraid to exist between categories. On screen, he brought that same fluidity to life. As Elio in Call Me By Your Name, he gave audiences something rare. A boy discovering desire with such tenderness, such aching honesty, that millions of viewers, especially queer ones, saw themselves reflected back. He never announced his sexuality. He never needed to. His presence alone carried the message. In interviews, he speaks carefully, thoughtfully, choosing words with the precision of someone who understands how much weight they carry. He advocates for LGBTQ+ rights. He talks about representation and the responsibility of storytelling, but he never centers himself in those conversations. What makes Timothée so compelling to queer audiences isn't just his roles or his fashion. It's the way he moves through the world. Fluid, confident, unbothered by the rigid codes that constrain most young men in Hollywood. He doesn't rebel loudly. He simply exists as he is, and that quiet confidence becomes its own form of resistance. For a generation raised on strict definitions of masculinity, Timothée offers something different. Proof that strength can be gentle, that beauty can be androgynous, that vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. He doesn't perform queerness. He embodies possibility. Kit Connor. The boy forced into daylight. Kit Connor was 18 years old when the internet decided his privacy didn't matter. Playing Nick Nelson in Heartstopper, he became the face of gentle, loving queer romance. The show resonated with millions, young people finally seeing relationships that felt tender, honest, real. And because Kit played the role with such warmth, such sincerity, fans began to blur the line between character and actor. They wanted him to be Nick Nelson in real life. And when he didn't immediately confirm his sexuality, the accusations started. Queer baiting, they called it. As if an actor owed the world an explanation. As if his privacy was somehow betrayal. By October 2022, the pressure became unbearable. Kit tweeted 8 words. "Back for a minute, I'm bi. Congrats for forcing an 18-year-old to out himself." The tweet was a gut punch, a reminder that behind every speculation, every demand for clarity, was a real person. A teenager navigating identity under the harshest spotlight imaginable. What should have been his personal journey, unfolding on his own timeline, became a public spectacle orchestrated by strangers who claimed to care about queer representation while stripping away his agency. Kit's story carries a painful lesson about the difference between support and pressure, between curiosity and cruelty. The same community that celebrates coming-out stories often forgets that coming out is deeply personal, a moment that belongs to the individual, not the audience. No one, no matter how beloved their character, owes the world a declaration of their identity. Today, Kit continues acting, his talent undeniable, his resilience remarkable. But his experience remains a stark warning about the cost of visibility, about how easily admiration can curdle into entitlement. At the heart of his story, and at the heart of Heartstopper itself, is a truth worth remembering. No one should have to prove their identity to deserve respect. Conan Gray, the poet of unspoken loneliness. Conan Gray writes songs that feel like secrets whispered in the dark, sad, tender, achingly beautiful. With his tousled hair and fluid fashion, his ruffled blouses and platform boots, he doesn't fit the traditional image of a pop star. He looks like someone who lives inside their feelings, who turns pain into poetry and loneliness into art. For queer listeners, his music became a lifeline. Not because he sang explicitly about being gay, but because every lyric carried the weight of feeling different, of loving people you can't have, of existing on the margins of other people's happiness. Songs like Heather and Maniac resonated with anyone who'd ever felt invisible, anyone who'd watched someone they loved choose someone else, anyone who knew the particular ache of hiding their heart. Conan never labeled his sexuality. He never felt the need to. His art spoke louder than any interview ever could. On stage, dressed in clothes that defied easy categorization, soft, expressive, unapologetically emotional, he created space for everyone who'd been told they were too much or too strange or too sensitive. "I write about my life," he once said, "and if people see themselves in that, then I'm doing my job." The internet, of course, speculated. Fans analyzed lyrics, dissected Instagram posts, searched for clues, but Conan remained unbothered, focused on the music rather than the narrative surrounding it. What made him so beloved wasn't certainty. It was recognition. Queer fans didn't need him to announce his identity to feel seen by his work. Every melancholic melody, every heart-wrenching verse felt like a mirror reflecting their own hidden struggles. In a culture obsessed with labels and clear definitions, Conan offered something rarer, the freedom to feel deeply without explanation, to exist in the beautiful, messy space between categories. For those who've ever felt like they don't belong anywhere, Conan Gray's music doesn't just comfort, it validates. Damiano David, glitter, chaos, and unapologetic freedom. Damiano David doesn't walk onto a stage, he explodes onto it. Glitter clings to his skin, eyeliner sharp as a knife, mesh shirts revealing more than they hide, platform boots adding inches to an already towering presence, and the confidence, reckless, magnetic, impossible to ignore. Since Måneskin's explosive Eurovision win in 2021, Damiano has become rock's most visible symbol of gender-fluid rebellion. He kisses his bandmates mid-performance. He struts in clothes that blur every line between masculine and feminine. He commands attention not through aggression, but through sheer charisma. His style echoes legends: Freddie Mercury's theatricality, David Bowie's androgyny, Prince's fearless sensuality. But Damiano isn't imitating. He's building something new, a vision of masculinity that's tender and fierce, flamboyant and grounded, free from the constraints that suffocate most men in rock music. In interviews, he speaks about masculinity with unusual clarity. "I don't think there should be rules," he's said. "You should be able to wear whatever you want, love whoever you want, without being judged." Those words aren't just progressive talking points. They're reflected in everything he does, the way he moves, the way he dresses, the way he exists without apology. Fans don't need a label to understand what he represents. Every performance is a statement about freedom, about rejecting the narrow definitions society imposes, about living so loudly and authentically that silence becomes impossible. The infamous kiss with bassist Victoria De Angelis at a concert? Not a stunt. A declaration that affection, fluidity, and expression belong on the biggest stages, under the brightest lights. Damiano David proves that rock and roll was always meant to be dangerous, not because of drugs or violence, but because of the threat it poses to conformity. He reminds us that the most radical act is simply refusing to be contained. For a generation craving authenticity in an era of carefully curated personas, Damiano offers pure, unfiltered freedom. Ross Lynch, from Disney boy to indie rock. Icon. Ross Lynch started as Disney's golden-haired boy next door on Austin and Alley. Safe, wholesome, designed to appeal to middle America. But somewhere between that squeaky clean image and the formation of the Driver era, something shifted. Ross shed the polish and found something real. On stage with his brother Rocky, Ross doesn't just perform, he inhabits the music. Shirtless, sweat catching the spotlight, hips moving to sultry bass lines. The choreography isn't calculated. It's instinctive, sensual, alive. His fashion evolved too. Crop tops, sheer blouses, silk scarves, and painted nails. Each choice felt less like a costume and more like liberation, a shedding of the persona Disney built, and the emergence of something far more interesting. By Pride 2023, the queer internet had fully embraced him, not because of any announcement, but because of the way he existed, confident, expressive, unbothered by rigid definitions of masculinity. Ross never confirmed or denied speculation about his sexuality. He didn't need to. His presence spoke volumes. The fluid fashion, the comfort with ambiguity, the natural ease with which he moved between traditionally masculine and feminine aesthetics. What makes Ross compelling isn't loud rebellion, it's quiet confidence. He doesn't perform queerness for applause or reject it for safety. He simply exists as himself, letting the audience interpret as they will. In interviews, he's thoughtful, articulate, choosing words carefully without ever boxing himself in. He advocates for authenticity, for living without fear, for creating art that feels honest rather than marketable. For fans who grew up watching him on Disney Channel, his evolution feels like permission, proof that the person you were at 18 doesn't have to define the person you become. Ross Lynch proves that transformation isn't betrayal, it's growth. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself evolve, even when the world wants to keep you frozen in the image they first loved. Lee Pace, elegance, mystery, and quiet power. With his 6'5" frame, striking features, and classic leading man looks, Lee Pace could have easily played Hollywood's game, become the stoic action hero, the uncomplicated romantic lead, the safe choice. Instead, he built a career on complexity. From Thranduil's ethereal grace in The Hobbit to Joe McMillan's sharp enigma in *Halt and Catch Fire*, Lee brings unusual depth to every role. His performances carry a quiet queerness, not as stereotype or gimmick, but as an undercurrent of fluidity and emotional intelligence that lingers long after the screen fades. Off-screen, he lives with intentionality. His social media doesn't shout for attention. It whispers beauty. Sunlit hikes, candid portraits in linen, moments of calm that radiate self-assurance without arrogance. Openly married to a man, Lee shows that queerness isn't about labels or spectacle, but about steady presence and grace. He doesn't perform identity for cameras. He simply lives it. His style reflects that philosophy. Sharp suits softened with flowing fabrics, open-necked shirts that blur formality and sensuality. Every choice feels natural, an extension of who he is rather than who the industry wants him to be. For many, Lee represents a new kind of masculinity, expansive, tender, yet powerful. He proves that strength and sensitivity aren't opposites but companions, that vulnerability is courage, that living authentically requires no explanation. In a culture that often confuses loudness for confidence, Lee's quiet assurance stands out. He doesn't need to announce himself or justify his existence. He simply is, elegant, mysterious, undeniably present. His performances carry that same quality. Whether playing an elf king or a tech visionary, he brings layers of emotion that resist easy categorization. Audiences sense something beneath the surface, something complex and true. Lee Pace reminds us that some of the most powerful statements are made in silence, that authenticity doesn't require performance, and that living on your own terms is the most radical act of all. Charles Melton, the quiet ache of tender masculinity. Charles Melton arrived on Riverdale as the brooding jock. Muscles, jawline, the kind of looks that fit easily into Hollywood's narrow definition of desirable masculinity. But in May-December, audiences saw something entirely different. A performance so raw, so vulnerable, that it felt like watching someone's heart break in real time. Playing a man confronting the complexity of his past, Charles brought tenderness that felt almost unbearable. His eyes carried grief. His movements suggested fragility beneath strength. And the silence between his words spoke louder than dialogue ever could. For many queer viewers, it wasn't just a performance, it was recognition. The ache of living with secrets, the weight of stories too complicated to explain, the loneliness of being misunderstood. Off-screen, Charles reinforced that impression. In interviews about the role, he spoke with unusual honesty about emotional strain, about carrying someone else's pain, about questioning his own limits as an actor. His voice cracked. He admitted to crying. He talked about empathy as both gift and burden. In a culture that prizes stoicism in men, his openness felt radical, a reminder that strength can exist in gentleness, that vulnerability is courage, that real masculinity has room for tears. The internet predictably speculated. Fans analyzed every gesture, every interview, searching for clues about his identity. But Charles never labeled himself. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the message. Identity isn't always a declaration. Sometimes it's a quiet language of glances, pauses, and unspoken understanding. For countless fans, Charles became the archetype of the introspective boy with a poet's melancholy. Whether queer or not, his energy felt safe, intimate, familiar. He reminds us that some of the most powerful performances aren't about what's said, but what's felt, the unspoken truths that live in the spaces between words. They never held press conferences, never posed with rainbow flags for magazine covers, never traded their privacy for headlines. And yet, they changed everything. Through style, through presence, through the quiet confidence of simply existing on their own terms, these 8 people showed the world that identity doesn't require a script. That authenticity can live in the space between labels. That sometimes the most revolutionary act is refusing to perform yourself for an audience that demands explanation. Harry's shimmer, Timothée's grace, Kit's resilience, Conan's poetry, Damiano's chaos, Ross's evolution, Lee's elegance, Charles's tenderness, each one a mirror reflecting something the world tried to hide, proof that masculinity can be fluid, that beauty can be ambiguous, that freedom lives in refusing to be contained. They taught us that visibility isn't always about words. Sometimes it's about living so authentically that silence becomes its own statement. If their stories moved you, share them. Because some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood.